The small hand slipped into Susanna Pritchard's calloused fingers before she had even set down the last crate of flour, and the world as she had known it for the past 3 years cracked straight down the middle like drought-hardened earth after the first hard rain. "Come see what Papa built for you," the little girl said. Susanna's heart stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. She turned slowly. The afternoon sun of that October 1882 afternoon burning the back of her neck, dust swirling around her boots, the smell of pine resin and iron-rich soil thick in the dry Colorado air. The child looking up at her could not have been more than 7 years old, with eyes the precise shade of river-washed slate that Susanna had spent 3 years trying to forget. Dark hair, 2 uneven braids, a smear of sawdust along her left cheek as though she had been leaning against fresh-cut lumber not an hour ago. "What did you say?" Susanna whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. "Papa built something for you," the girl repeated with the patient certainty only children possess. "He said you would come today. He said you always come on the 3rd Thursday. He has been working on it since spring." "Since spring? 6 months." Susanna's grip on the child's hand tightened without her meaning for it to, and she felt the earth shift beneath her boots as the full, terrifying weight of those 2 words settled over her like a winter coat pulled on in the wrong season. 6 months ago, she had stood on the ridge above Gilbert Townsend's homestead and told herself she was done. That whatever had begun between them during those long autumn evenings the year prior, the conversations that stretched past midnight, the way he always managed to find some reason to stand close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his sun-darkened arms, all of it needed to end before it became something she could not survive losing. She had convinced herself it was self-preservation. She had not convinced her heart. And now here was this child, this small, miraculous child, pulling her toward whatever Gilbert Townsend had spent half a year building, and Susanna Pritchard, who had survived a drought that killed her father's cattle, a flood that took her mother, a con man who had stolen 2 years of her life under the guise of courtship, and a 300-mile journey to run her uncle's supply route alone, could not take a single step. "Are you scared?" the girl asked, tilting her head with the unguarded directness of the very young. Susanna looked down at her. "What is your name?" "Clara," the girl said. "Clara Townsend. I am 7 3/4. Papa says I am the best thing that ever happened to him, but I think maybe you might be the second best because he smiles different when your wagon comes up the road." The words were a knife and a balm at the same time. "How long have you been watching your father smile when my wagon comes?" Susanna asked, and her voice was steadier than she deserved. Clara considered this with great seriousness. "Always," she said. Susanna drew a slow breath of Colorado mountain air, looked back at the supply wagon she had parked beside the fence post, confirmed that the brake was set and the 2 horses were tied. And then, because Clara Townsend was still holding her hand and looking up at her with those impossible slate-gray eyes, she let herself be led toward whatever came next. The story of how Susanna Pritchard came to be standing on Gilbert Townsend's land that October afternoon was not simple, and it was not short, and it began not with romance but with a debt and a dark past, and a decision made under duress. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1879, Susanna had arrived in the Colorado Territory from Kansas with $42, a mule she did not yet know was half lame, a letter from her uncle Aldous Pritchard, and a bruise along her left jaw that she had told everyone was from a fall off a porch step. Her uncle Aldous ran a modest but steady supply operation out of the town of Harrow's Creek, servicing a network of homesteads and ranches spread across roughly 60 miles of mountain terrain east of the San Juan Range. He was 61, had no children of his own, and had written to Susanna after her mother's death because he had heard from her father, who was too proud to ask for help himself, that she needed a way out. What Aldous had not told her in the letter was that he was ill. She had discovered this within the first week, when she found him doubled over the ledger books in the back room of the Harrow's Creek Mercantile at 2 in the morning. And when she pressed him, He told her with the matter-of-fact resignation of a man who has already made his peace with a difficult truth that the doctor in Denver had given him perhaps 2 years, possibly 3, and that he had been hoping she would come because there was nobody else to take over the route when the time came. It was not the warm reunion she had imagined. But Susanna was 24 years old and had spent the last 2 years watching a man she had trusted dismantle her faith in her own judgment piece by piece, and she had arrived in Colorado already stripped of the luxury of expecting warmth. What she found instead was purpose, and in those early days, purpose was enough. Aldous taught her everything. The route, the customers, the temperament of each horse in the stable, the way to pack a wagon so that the flour stayed dry even when the creek crossings ran high, the art of setting fair prices without inviting either resentment or exploitation, the names of every homesteader's children, and what each family needed most when the supplies ran low. He was a demanding teacher, unsparing in his corrections, but he was honest, and after 2 years of dishonesty that had cost her nearly everything, honesty felt like the richest gift she had ever been given. She had first seen Gilbert Townsend on a bright February morning in 1880, when the snow was still thick on the ridges, but the lower meadows were beginning to show patches of frozen brown grass, and she had brought his quarterly supplies in the heavy freight wagon because Aldous was having one of his bad weeks and could not make the trip himself. She had expected to find the same man Aldous had described to her, a widower, quiet, keeps to himself, pays on time, has a daughter he is raising alone. She had not expected the way he came down from the fence he was repairing at the sound of the wagon, the way he moved with the particular unhurried efficiency of someone who is never still but never rushed, the way his eyes, when he looked up and realized it, was not Aldous, but a woman driving the wagon, did not widen in surprise or narrow in suspicion, but simply settled into a sort of careful attentiveness, as though he was recalibrating without making a production of it. "You must be Aldous' niece," he said, and it was not a question. "Susanna Pritchard," she said, and climbed down from the wagon with the automatic competence of someone who has been doing it for months, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm without the performance of it. "Gilbert Townsend. Did Aldous send a list?" "He did." She reached into the pocket of her coat and produced the folded paper. "Though I also brought extra salt pork because the road over Miller's Pass will be impassable in another week, and you are the last stop on the Eastern Loop." He looked at her, then in a way that was slightly different from the careful attentiveness of a moment before, and she would only understand years later that it was the moment he had noticed her as a person rather than as a function. At the time she simply noted that he was perhaps 30 or 31, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat practically, with a square jaw that carried the particular set of a man accustomed to keeping his emotions below the surface, and eyes that were gray with a suggestion of green in them, or green with a suggestion of gray. It was difficult to say which, only that they were watchful and direct, and not unkind. "Good thinking," he said about the salt pork. "The pass will be drifted over by Saturday." "I know," she said. "I checked with the trapper at the junction. He said Friday if the wind picks up." Something shifted in his expression, a fractional softening, not a smile, not yet, but the architectural beginning of one. "Can you stay for coffee?" he said. "It is cold and it is a long ride back." "I have 3 more stops before the light goes," she said, "but thank you." She had driven away feeling strangely warm despite the February air, and she had told herself it was just the relief of having managed the route without Aldous and found it no more difficult than expected. She was 25 years old and a moderately competent liar, but only to herself. Through that first year, she saw him every 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes more often in spring when the homesteaders were restocking after winter, sometimes less in the deep summer months when the route expanded, and the days stretched so long that she could cover more ground per trip and needed fewer runs. Each time she arrived at the Townsend homestead there was coffee, eventually, once she had learned to time her route so that she finished the Eastern Loop with enough daylight remaining for a brief stop, and each time the conversation that accompanied the coffee went slightly further than the one before. She learned that his wife, Eleanor, had died of childbed fever 4 days after Clara was born, in the spring of 1875, that he had been 27 at the time, that he had never expected to be alone with a newborn in the Colorado mountains, and that his first year of it had nearly broken him in ways he did not elaborate on, and she did not push him about, because she understood the particular privacy of survival. She learned that he had come to Colorado from Ohio in 1872 with a leaner and a plan that involved cattle, and that the plan had worked moderately well but not in the way he had imagined, and that after Eleanor's death, he had quietly shifted his focus to horses because cattle were a communal enterprise and he had found himself, in those grief-heavy years, unable to manage much that was communal. He bred horses. Good ones. She had seen them in the paddock from the first visit, a small herd of unusually fine animals, and it was the horses that eventually gave her the opening she had not known she was looking for, because she had grown up around horses. Her father had kept a small stable in Kansas, and she knew what she was looking at, and one afternoon in the late summer of 1880 she had stood at the paddock fence while Gilbert let out a young roan mare and said without thinking, "Her right front tendon is showing stress. See how she carries her weight slightly back on that foot. Not lame yet, but she will be in a month if you do not change how you are working her." He had stopped and looked at the mare and then looked at Susanna, and there had been something in that look that she recognized, though she would not name it for a long time, as the specific expression of a person who has just realized that someone else sees the world in a way that matters to them. "You know horses," he said. "My father's horses were his religion," she said. "I was raised in the church." He had laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was full and genuine and completely unguarded, and it hit her somewhere below the sternum with a force she had not anticipated. She had looked back at the mare very deliberately and said something careful about tendon wrapping, and he had nodded, and they had talked horses for 40 minutes, and she had missed the light entirely, and had to navigate the first mile of mountain road in the early dark, and she had done so with something she was not ready to call happiness rising in her chest. In the autumn of 1880, Aldous declined significantly. By November he could no longer leave the mercantile on foot, and by December he was confined largely to the apartment above it, and Susanna was running the entire operation on her own, which was a great deal of work, but which she found she was capable of in a way that she had not known about herself before, and which gave her a fierce, private satisfaction. She hired a boy from town to help load and unload, and she kept the books herself, and she managed the relationships with every homesteader and rancher on the route with the careful diplomacy of someone who understands that trust is a currency that takes years to accumulate and a single mistake to spend. The route continued through the winter of 1880 to 1881, and the stops at the Townsend homestead continued, and the conversations continued, and Clara Townsend, who was 5 years old that winter, began to appear at the fence when Susanna's wagon came up the road, first just watching from a distance with the spectacular solemnity of a small child observing something new, and then gradually, by February, running to the fence and reaching up to be lifted down, and then, by March, climbing up to sit beside Susanna on the wagon seat and announcing her opinions on the scenery with great authority. It was impossible not to love Clara Townsend. Susanna had not expected to, because she had not expected to be around the child long enough to love her, but Clara had a quality of absolute directness that Susanna found disarming and then irresistible. She said exactly what she thought. She was curious about everything, and she attached herself to Susanna with the complete absence of self-consciousness that is the singular privilege of children who have never been told they want too much. The love she was developing for the child's father was considerably more complicated and considerably more frightening. She was aware of it by the spring of 1881. She was not happy about it. She catalogued with meticulous honesty every reason it was a terrible idea. She had been wrong about a man before in catastrophic ways and had lost 2 years and a great deal of pride to the mistake. She had responsibilities now, a business to run, an uncle to care for, a life she was building carefully and alone. Gilbert Townsend had lost his wife in a way that had quietly reorganized him around a core of self-sufficiency, and she could not read whether there was room in that reorganization for anyone new. And most practically, most damningly, she could not afford to jeopardize the professional relationship, because the Townsend account was one of the most reliable on the route and losing. It would hurt the business, and if the business failed, she had nowhere to go. So she drew a line. She drew it carefully, and she told herself it was the right thing to do, and she kept her visits professional and pleasant and slightly shorter than she wanted them to be, and she redirected every conversation that tilted toward the personal with the skilled grace of someone who has had practice at it. What she did not account for was what Gilbert Townsend was doing on his side of the line. He was building something. But she did not know that yet. Aldous Pritchard died in the October of 1881, quietly and without much fuss, in the way he had lived. He left Susanna the mercantile, the supply business, the horses, the wagon, the roots, and a letter that said he was proud of her, and that she should stop being afraid, and that life was shorter than the mountains made it look. The letter made her cry for an hour, and then she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept her important papers and went back to work. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was hard. The route was hers alone now, and she had the mercantile to manage in addition to the deliveries, and there were weeks when she was running on 4 hours of sleep and sheer stubbornness. She did not reduce the service on any part of the route. She hired a second boy to help in the mercantile, and she trained him carefully, and she kept going. She was 26 years old, and she had built something real, and she was not going to let it fall. She saw Gilbert less that winter, not by intention but by necessity, her roots sometimes pushing her past his stop as darkness fell, and twice she sent the supply crates ahead with a note instead of delivering them in person. The first time she sent a note, she told herself it was purely logistical. The second time, she knew that it was also cowardice, and she was not comfortable with that knowledge, but she was tired enough that she filed it and kept moving. In the spring of 1882, something changed. She arrived at the Townsend homestead on a Thursday in March, the snow still deep in the high passes but the lower land already thawing, mud sucking at the wagon wheels on the last quarter-mile of track. Clara came running as always, older now, 6.5, and immediately climbed up beside Susanna and told her at length about a barn cat that had produced 4 kittens, and whether each kitten had a name and what those names were, and why they had been chosen. Susanna listened and asked the appropriate questions and helped Clara down when they reached the fence, and when Gilbert came across the yard to help with the crates, there was something different in the way he looked at her. Not different in the sense of warmer or cooler, different in the sense of decided, like a man who has made up his mind about something and is now simply waiting for the right moment. She had spent the drive home deeply unsettled, turning the sensation over and looking at it from different angles, unable to identify exactly what she was afraid of, only that she was, and that the fear had the particular quality of the kind that exists not because you think you will fail, but because you think you might succeed. And success in this direction meant exposure, and exposure meant the possibility of a wound she might not recover from. By May, she had convinced herself that she had imagined the look. By June, she was monitoring her own reactions to his name, with the anxious attention of someone taking their own temperature during a fever. By July, when Clara presented her with a wildflower crown she had made and placed it on Susanna's head with great ceremony and said, "Papa says you are the prettiest person who comes to our house." Susanna had sat very still on the wagon seat and looked across the yard to where Gilbert was pretending to examine a fence post and not looking at her, and she had felt the line she had drawn begin to dissolve at the edges. She had stayed too long that day. She had accepted the coffee and then a second cup, and they had talked about the dry spell that was threatening the eastern ranches, and about a rancher 2 stops over who was having trouble with a diseased herd, and about whether the mountain road would hold up through another dry summer, and all of it was practical and reasonable, and in no way crossed any line she had drawn. And yet by the time she drove away the sun was nearly at the ridgeline, and she was shaking slightly in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The following week she had arrived to find a second chair on the porch. Previously there had been one. A plain wooden chair, the kind you make yourself from what you have, and Gilbert had always leaned against the porch post while they talked, and she had assumed he simply did not think to bring another chair out. But this time there were 2 chairs and a small table between them, and Clara was sitting in one of the chairs with a book open on her lap. And when Susanna climbed down from the wagon, Clara looked up and said, "Papa made that chair for you." Susanna had stood in the yard and looked at the chair and then at Gilbert, who was coming from the stable, and she had said, "You made a chair," and he had said, "The porch post was getting harder on my back," and they had both known that was not the whole truth. She had sat in the chair and they had talked until the sky turned colors, and when she finally stood to leave, he had walked her to the wagon and stood at the wheel and looked up at her as she gathered the reins, and he had said, quietly, with the careful precision of a man who has thought about his words for a long time, "I would like for you to come for reasons other than the supplies sometimes, Susanna, if you were willing." She had held the reins very still and looked at the road ahead and said, "Gilbert, I do not think that is wise." And he had said, "I know," and stepped back from the wheel, and she had driven away. That was July. She had not mentioned it in August. He had not mentioned it in August. The deliveries had continued, and they had both been exquisitely careful and equally miserable, and Clara had watched them with the shrewd perceptiveness of a child who does not understand exactly what is happening, but knows very well that something is. In September she had been delayed on the western loop by a wagon axle that split at the worst possible moment, 3 miles from the nearest settlement, and she had spent 6 hours waiting for the boy she sent running for help to return with one of the men from the Harker ranch. And by the time she had reached Harrow's Creek, it was night, and she was cold and furious with herself, and with the axle, and with the general circumstances of her life, and the feeling that had been building all summer. The feeling of standing at the edge of something and refusing to step because stepping was dangerous had reached a pitch she could no longer comfortably sustain. She had sat in the mercantile that night with her uncle's letter open on the table in front of her. She had read his words again, the ones about fear, the ones about life and mountains. She had made a decision, or she had thought she had made one. In the cold light of morning she had second-guessed it, and then second-guessed the second-guessing, and in the paralysis of it had done the thing she later understood was her greatest mistake in this whole complicated business. She had withdrawn entirely. She had sent the October supplies with a note. She had restructured the Eastern Loop to come on a Tuesday instead of a Thursday, which meant a different travel time, which meant she had a reasonable logistical excuse for cutting the visit short. She had told herself it was protection. Gilbert Townsend had received her note about the October supplies and the restructured route, and he had sat with it for a while, and then he had gone into his workshop. And he had started building, not the chair. That had been an invitation. What he built through the winter and spring of 1882 was something else entirely, something larger, something that required planning and intention and a specific kind of faith. And the only person in the world who knew about it was a 7-year-old girl with 2 uneven braids and slate-gray eyes who had inherited her father's particular quality of decided certainty. Susanna did not know any of this as Clara led her across the yard that October afternoon in 1882. She knew only that her heart was behaving very badly and that the sawdust smell was getting stronger as they rounded the corner of the main house, and that Gilbert Townsend was standing outside his workshop with his arms crossed and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and an expression on his face that she had never quite seen before. It was the look of a man who has put everything he has on one number and is waiting for the wheel to stop. The workshop door was open. Go see, Clara said, and released Susanna's hand with the confidence of someone who has complete faith in the outcome. Susanna looked at Gilbert. He uncrossed his arms. He held them slightly out from his sides, an open posture, a vulnerable one, the posture of a man who has said, "This is all I have and I am not hiding any of it." "It started as a storage room for supplies," he said. "Something practical. Somewhere you could store the overflow when the creek road is flooded and you cannot make the deliveries until the water goes down, so you would not have to drive back to town in the dark." She stared at him. "And then I kept thinking about what else would make it useful for you. And I added a proper desk, because I have watched you do your ledger books on the tailgate of the wagon, and I know that is not adequate. And a place to sleep if the road is not safe at night, and a stove. And then I thought about the windows because you told me once that you like to see the mountains when you work." He stopped. She said nothing because she was not capable of saying anything. "It is not a trap," he said quietly, and the word landed with weight because they both understood he was speaking to something specific, to the dark past she had never fully explained but which he had clearly, carefully, observed over 3 years. "There is no hidden motive. There is no forced choice. It is yours whether or not anything else ever happens. I built it because I wanted you to have somewhere solid that belonged to you on this part of the route, and because I am better at building things than I am at the correct words." Susanna Pritchard, who had not cried in front of another person since her mother's funeral in the spring of 1878, felt her eyes fill. She turned away from him and walked into the workshop. It was extraordinary, not grand. Nothing about Gilbert Townsend was ever about grandeur. But it was done with such complete attention to her that it was more intimate than any grand gesture could have been. The desk was positioned at the window that faced the mountain range to the west, with a shelf above it at exactly the right height for the ledger books she carried. The storage space was built along the back wall with labeled sections for flour, salt, medical supplies, the categories she stocked and delivered, and the shelving was deep enough and correctly spaced. The sleeping area was a simple, clean alcove with a good, solid rope and plank frame and a folded quilt, not decorative but warm. The stove was small and efficient, and beside it a neat stack of wood. On the desk, in a small clay pot that Clara had clearly painted with uneven but enthusiastic flowers, were 3 fresh wildflowers. She stood at the desk and looked out the west window at the mountains and breathed. She heard his step behind her, not rushing, not crowding, just present. "Clara painted the pot," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice was rough. "Susanna." He said her name the way you say the name of something you have been careful with for a very long time. She turned around. He was close, close enough that she could see the careful set of his jaw and the watchfulness in those gray-green eyes, and the way his hands were still held open at his sides, still that vulnerable posture, still that total honesty. "I have been afraid," she said, before she could stop herself. "I have very specific and well-founded reasons to be afraid of being wrong about a person." "I know," he said. "I have watched you be afraid for 2 years. I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to let me be worth the risk." The silence between them was the kind that precedes things that cannot be taken back. "Why?" she asked, and it was the question she had been holding for 3 years, the one underneath all the other questions. The one she had been most afraid to ask because the answer would either be insufficient or more than she knew how to carry. "Because you saw my horse's tendon before I did," he said, and then, more quietly, "because you read to Clara from the geography book without making it a lesson. Because you argue with me about fair prices and you are always right and you are never smug about it. Because you drove through the February blizzard of last year to make sure old Harker had his medicine, and you told nobody about it. Because I watched you rebuild something after whatever happened to you before you came here, and I have never seen anyone do that with more grace. And I have been in love with you for the better part of 2 years, and I am tired of building furniture as a substitute for saying so." Her breath left her in a way that was not entirely voluntary. 2 years, she said. At least, he said. And you waited. You needed time, he said simply. I was not going to rush you. I was not going to push. Whatever happened to you before, I know it had to do with a man not respecting what you needed, and I would rather wait forever than be that. The last of the wall she had built, the one she had assembled brick by careful brick out of the rubble of her confidence in her own heart, came apart. It did not fall dramatically. It simply became unnecessary, like a coat that has been buttoned against a cold that has finally broken. She crossed the remaining distance between them, and she took his face in her hands, her calloused supply route hands, and she looked at him for a long moment, looking for the hidden motive she had trained herself to find, the dark past that would rewrite everything once revealed, the trap. She found none of those things. She found only a man who had spent 2 years building things for her while respecting her enough not to say so until he had something concrete to show her. She kissed him. It was not tentative. It was not the kiss of two people unsure of themselves. It was the kiss of two people who have been absurdly careful for far too long and have finally, with great relief, stopped. Outside the workshop, Clara Townsend sat on the fence post and swung her legs and examined the mountains and was satisfied. The weeks that followed were not without their complexity, because nothing in life is without its complexity, and Susanna Pritchard had not arrived at 27 years old without accumulating the wisdom to know that the beginning of a thing is not the same as the thing itself. She continued to run the route. She had not built the business to abandon it, and Gilbert had never suggested she should, which was one of the things that mattered enormously. She still drove the supply wagon on Thursdays and Tuesdays. She still managed the ledgers and the relationships and the difficult spring roads and the impossible winter passes, and Gilbert continued to run his horse operation with the quiet, methodical competence that was his particular genius. But the visits were different now. She stayed longer, openly, and without the elaborate justifications she had previously constructed to excuse a second cup of coffee. She brought Clara books from the mercantile in town, geography and natural history primarily, because Clara had strong opinions about learning useful things, and in the evenings when she stayed past supper, she and Clara would read together at the kitchen table while Gilbert worked nearby, and the domesticity of it both frightened her and fit her like nothing she had ever worn before. In November, she told him about the man in Kansas. She had not planned to. They were sitting on the porch in the early dark, the temperature dropping fast the way it did at altitude in autumn, both of them wrapped in separate blankets and watching the stars come out in a sky so clear it felt like a rebuke to the modern age. And he had said something simple about how she clearly understood people well, and she had said, not entirely voluntarily, "I did not always." And from there it had come out. His name had been Roland Fletcher. He had come to her father's farm in the spring of 1877, when Susanna was 22, and her mother was already ill, and her father was distracted and struggling, and he had presented himself as a cattle broker with good prospects and an honest face. And Susanna, who was smart but who had not yet learned that intelligence is not the same as immunity from manipulation, had believed him. Roland Fletcher had been neither a cattle broker nor honest. He had been a man with a gift for identifying lonely people and a willingness to exploit that loneliness systematically. He had courted her for 8 months, borrowed money from her father for a business venture that existed only on paper, and when the fraud had finally come apart, the bruise along her jaw had been his parting gift, along with the knowledge that she had endorsed loans that her father would spend 2 years repaying. She told Gilbert all of it in a flat, contained voice, the voice of someone who has made peace with a hard thing by placing it outside herself and examining it from a safe distance. When she finished, there was a silence. "He hit you," Gilbert said, and the quietness of his voice was the particular quietness of controlled fury which she recognized as entirely different from violence. "Once," she said, "when I told him I was going to the sheriff." "Did you?" "Yes." He had moved on by the time the sheriff looked for him. Gilbert did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I understand better now." "Which part?" "All of it," he said. "The lines you drew, the way you watched me." The way you made sure there was always an exit available. She had not known she had been doing that last part consciously, and hearing it named so precisely shook her. "I am sorry," she said. "It was not fair to you." "You were protecting yourself," he said. "That is not something you need to apologize for." He paused. "Though I will say, for what it is worth, that the only thing I have ever wanted to build for you is the workshop. I do not have any hidden debts or borrowed identities or agendas I have not disclosed." She looked at him in the dark and the starlight, and she believed him, and the believing felt extraordinary. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "Fully." "I am working on it," she said honestly. "I trust you more than I have trusted anyone in 4 years. That is the truth." He reached across the space between the two chairs and took her hand, and they sat like that until the cold drove them inside, and it was one of the better evenings of Susanna Pritchard's 27 years. December brought snow and difficulty, and a level of logistical challenge that would have been staggering had Susanna not spent 3 years building her competence for exactly this kind of thing. The high passes closed at the end of November, which meant the eastern loop had to be restructured to cut back through the lower valleys, which added 2 days to the route but kept it viable. She had made the adaptations to this route in advance, had prepositioned stock at 2 intermediate points where she had arrangements with smaller merchants, and when the snow came, she was ready for it. She spent Christmas at the Townsend homestead. This had not been planned exactly, though in retrospect the planning had been occurring in the background of other things for several weeks. Clara had asked her in November if she would come for Christmas Day, and Susanna had said she would try, which was the careful answer. And then she had gone home and arranged the mercantile schedule so that Christmas Day fell in the middle of her rest period between the western and eastern loops, which meant she had no legitimate logistical reason not to come. And she had come, and brought a geography book and a new set of drawing pencils for Clara, and a pair of good leather-work gloves for Gilbert. And Clara had given her a drawing of the supply wagon and the horses that was remarkably accurate for a 7-year-old. Gilbert had given her a compass. A good one, a proper surveyor's compass, brass-bodied and accurate, because she had mentioned once in passing that hers had begun to drift and had not yet been replaced. He had engraved her initials on the back, S.B., in small, careful letters that she traced with her thumb when she thought no one was watching. After Clara was in bed, they sat by the fire and he told her about Eleanor, really told her, not the summary version but the full account, the woman Eleanor had been, the humor she had possessed, the homesickness she had fought through and mostly conquered, the illness that had come on so fast that even now, 7 years later, there was a part of it that did not entirely make sense. He told her about the 4 days between Clara's birth and Eleanor's death, the way he had existed in those 4 days in a state of such complete emotional contradiction, the joy of the child and the terror of the dying, that he had sometimes since wondered if those 4 days were responsible for the particular quality of his self-containment. "She would have liked you," he said at the end. "Eleanor. She had a strong opinion about competent women. She would have said about time, probably, that I found one." Susanna had laughed at that, a real surprised laugh, and then sobered. "I am sorry for what you lost," she said. "I was too," he said. "For a long time. I am not any more exactly. It is more that I carry it differently." "Yes," she said, understanding him precisely. The new year of 1883 came in cold and clear, and Susanna was in Harrow's Creek when it did, standing outside the mercantile with a cup of coffee watching the neighbors celebrate with fireworks salvaged from the Independence Day stock, and thinking about the spring. She had been thinking about the spring because there was a question that had been circling in the background of everything since October, one that she had not yet asked, and that Gilbert had not yet answered, perhaps because they were both still in the careful mode, still treating the thing between them with the delicacy of something new and fragile. But it was not new anymore, and though she was not entirely certain it was not fragile, she was becoming increasingly certain that it was strong, that the particular nature of their attachment was of the kind that does not break easily but rather flexes and adjusts the way good timber does, and that this quality was what she had been looking for without knowing it for her entire adult life. In February, she had a conversation with the banker in Harrow's Creek about the mercantile's finances. The business was healthy, healthier than it had been under Aldous because she had streamlined several things and added 2 new accounts, and the banker told her she had built something solid, and she received this information with the private satisfaction it deserved. What the conversation also clarified was that she could, if she chose, afford to hire a full-time manager for the mercantile, someone to run the store itself, which would free her to focus entirely on the delivery route, which was where the real margins were and where her skill was most effectively applied. She was not sure what she was planning with this information. She put it away and kept working. In March, Gilbert asked her to marry him, not as a grand romantic spectacle, because he was not built for spectacle, but with the same direct honesty he brought to everything else. One evening after supper when Clara was asleep, and the fire was burning low, and Susanna was pulling on her coat to make the ride back to town in the cold, he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know there is no correct answer and no pressure behind it, only the question itself." And she had turned around with her coat half-buttoned and looked at him, and he had said, "Will you marry me?" She stood for a long moment with her coat half-buttoned. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was the kind of exhalation that tells you exactly how much someone has been holding their breath, and Susanna felt a surge of tenderness so acute it almost hurt. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I asked myself for about 2 years whether I was sure," she said, "and the answer was always yes, and I kept finding reasons not to listen to it. I am done doing that." She crossed the room and kissed him briefly and firmly and then stepped back. "I am going to keep the route," she said. "Of course," he said, as though this had never been in question because for him it hadn't. "And the mercantile. Yes. I will need to reorganize some things logistically. Tell me what I can do," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had been building things for her with patient hands and steadfast heart for 3 years, who had never once suggested that her independence was a problem to be solved rather than a quality to be respected. "You have already done the important thing," she said. "What was that?" "You let me take my time," she said. "That was the important thing." Clara Townsend received the news at breakfast the following morning when Susanna stayed overnight for the first time, in the workshop alcove that Gilbert had built for exactly this kind of necessity, and the child's response was to stand up from her chair and clap her hands twice with great authority and say, "I told Papa you would say yes," and then sit back down and continue her porridge with the serene composure of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. They married in May of 1883 in the Harrow's Creek Church, which was a small and not particularly impressive building but which had good light through the east window in the morning, and which was full of people because it turned out that Susanna Pritchard's years of running the supply route had generated more genuine affection in the community than she had been aware of. Old Harker came down from his ranch despite the knee that had been troubling him. The Harker boys cleaned up their boots. The woman who ran the boarding house brought a cake. The banker and his wife attended. Several of the ranchers' wives who had watched Susanna navigate the route alone for 3 years, who had been quietly rooting for her in the way that women root for other women who are doing hard things well, dressed in their best and sat in the front rows. Gilbert wore his good dark coat and looked at Susanna the whole way through the ceremony with the same expression she had first seen on his face that morning in October, the one that was the architectural beginning of something. She wore a dress the color of good Colorado sky, not white because she was practical and white showed the road, and she carried the wildflowers Clara had gathered that morning with complete seriousness and great selectivity, choosing only the ones she deemed properly dignified for the occasion. They said their vows without drama and with complete sincerity, and when they stepped out of the church into the May morning, the sky was the particular luminous blue that the Colorado high country produces in spring, and several of the assembled company produced an assortment of celebratory noises, and Gilbert took her hand with a grip that was firm and warm and entirely without the performance of it. And Clara walked beside them with her chin lifted in the posture of someone who has successfully engineered a satisfying outcome. The summer and autumn of 1883 were, by any reasonable measure, the best period of Susanna Pritchard Townsend's life up to that point. The logistics of her new living situation required some work. She and Gilbert discussed it practically and at length, and arrived at an arrangement that suited them both. She would run the route Monday through Thursday, staying the nights at the workshop as needed when weather or distance made returning to the homestead impractical, and Friday through Sunday she would be home. The mercantile she hired a manager for, a capable middle-aged widow from town, named Mrs. Aldrich, who had been running households and managing accounts under the heading of other people's names for 30 years, and was deeply relieved to be allowed to do it formally. The route thrived. Several new accounts came in as the population of the area slowly grew, new homesteaders arriving from the east with their optimism and their inadequate preparation for what the Colorado mountains actually required, and Susanna expanded the eastern loop to accommodate them, adding a full day to the schedule. Gilbert's horse operation also expanded that year. A particularly fine stallion he had bred producing 2 outstanding foals that attracted attention from ranchers across the county, and he sold them for prices that gave the homestead a financial cushion it had not previously had. Clara began school that autumn in a one-room schoolhouse that had been built the previous year in the small settlement of Pine Junction, 4 miles from the homestead. She attended with the same decisive energy she brought to everything else and quickly established herself as the student with the most opinions about geography, which her teacher found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. In November, Susanna told Gilbert she was pregnant. She told him in the workshop, which felt right, standing at the desk he had built for her, with the mountain view he had placed it to face, and she said it simply and directly, and he sat down in the chair that was in the corner for a moment, not his usual composure, and then stood up and came to her and held her with a care and a fierceness that told her everything about what Aliner's death had cost him and what this news meant. "We will get the doctor early," she said into his shoulder. "The best one in Denver if we can. We are not going to let what happened to Aliner happen here." "No," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "We are not." She continued the route through December and most of January, because she was healthy and capable, and the homesteaders depended on her. But she reduced the more difficult mountain sections, and reorganized the schedule so that she was never more than a few hours from the homestead or town. In February, she brought in the Denver doctor for a preliminary examination, and he told her everything was proceeding normally, and she noted this information and planned accordingly. The spring of 1884 was wet and difficult, with flooding in the lower valleys that took out 2 sections of road and kept the eastern loop inaccessible for almost 3 weeks. Susanna managed the disruption with the strategic efficiency of someone who has dealt with road failures before, rerouting through higher ground and prepositioning stock with the intermediate merchants again, and most of her customers received their supplies only slightly late, and with a written explanation from her that several of them kept. In April, she stopped running the route, not permanently. Temporarily, because the baby was due in May and she was not foolish, but temporarily had a specific weight to it because it was the first time in 4 years she had stopped, and she spent the first week of it in a state of restless agitation that drove Gilbert to suggest, with perfect calm, that she might consider organizing the workshop inventory if she needed something to do with her hands. She did. She reorganized the workshop inventory, and then the mercantile accounts, and then the eastern route schedule for the coming summer, and then Clara's book collection by subject, and then stopped herself before she reorganized the kitchen because she recognized in herself the signs of anxiety seeking a physical form, and she made herself sit on the porch instead and look at the mountains and breathe. Gilbert came and sat with her. "I am not good at waiting," she said. "I know," he said. "You are good at nearly everything else." She looked at him. "Are you frightened?" She asked because she had been careful not to ask it before now, but it was April and the baby was very close and she wanted to know the truth. "Yes," he said, directly and without qualification. "Good," she said. "It means we are both paying attention." He looked at her with an expression that she had by now catalogued in its full complexity, the gray-green eyes and the square jaw and the quality of complete presence that he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Susanna," he said, "whatever happens, you are the bravest person I know." "I am not brave," she said. "I am just stubborn." "Those look alike from the outside," he said. She laughed, and the laughter released something that had been wound tight in her chest, and she leaned against him in the late April afternoon sun with the mountains in front of them, and the sound of Clara in the house reading, aloud to herself with great expressiveness. And she thought that her Uncle Aldous had been right about fear, and about life and mountains. Their son was born on the 14th of May, 1884, in the homestead bedroom with the Denver doctor in attendance, and Clara stationed outside the door with the absolute certainty that she would hear everything of importance, regardless of what the adults thought about it. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's determination evident from the first moment. The way he arrived as though he had somewhere to be, and was annoyed by the delay. Gilbert held him and was not composed. It was the only time Susanna had ever seen him not composed, and it was beautiful. This big quiet man who built things with careful hands and chose his words precisely, standing with his son in the morning light with tears running freely down his face, and making no attempt to stop them. They named him James Aldous Townsend, the first name for Eleanor's father, who had been a good man, and the middle name for Aldous Pritchard, who had given Susanna the route and the letter and the way out that had led her here. Clara, allowed in to inspect her brother after the necessary interval, examined him with great thoroughness, and announced that he had a sensible face for someone who was currently unable to do anything useful, and that she intended to teach him geography as soon as he was capable of listening. The summer of 1884 was remarkable. Susanna returned to the route in July, with James Aldous 5 weeks old and perfectly competent in the care of Mrs. Harker, the rancher's wife who had volunteered for this role, with a degree of enthusiasm that Susanna found both touching and slightly alarming. Mrs. Harker had raised 6 children and had strong opinions about the correct way to do everything infant-related, and while Susanna did not agree with all of these opinions, she respected the competence behind them and was grateful for the help. The route felt different now. Not in any external way. The roads were the same roads, the customers were the same customers, the horses were the same horses, but she was different, and the difference was that she was no longer doing it purely from necessity or stubborn pride. She was doing it because it was hers, genuinely hers in the way that things are yours when you have chosen them freely, and the choice now came from a life full enough to leave and return to, which gave it a quality it had not previously had. She came home on Fridays to a homestead that was increasingly full of the evidence of a life being lived, James growing at a rate she found both astonishing and slightly alarming, Clara's drawings pinned to every available surface, Gilbert's horse operation generating a steady and growing income, the workshop she used twice a week still smelling of sawdust and good honest work. In the autumn of 1884, a situation arose that required her to deploy the full measure of everything she had built. A new merchant had arrived in Harrow's Creek, a man named Corbett Vines, who had set up a competing supply operation with the backing of a larger commercial concern from Denver. His prices were lower, his wagons were newer, and he had made it clear to several of the homesteaders on her route that he intended to offer the same service at significantly reduced cost. 2 of her Eastern Loop customers had already switched their orders. She sat with this for a week. It was a genuine threat, the kind that had a dark future if she handled it wrong, and she was honest with herself about the possibility that the business she had built could be undercut if Vines's backing proved deep enough. Then she went and met with every single customer on both loops. Not to sell against him, not to argue prices, but to ask them directly what they needed from a supply operation that they were not currently getting. She listened to the answers without defensiveness, and with the full attention she had learned from years of reading what people actually needed versus what they said they needed. What she found was that Corbett Vines could undercut her on price, but could not offer what she offered, which was specific, detailed knowledge of each homestead situation. The kind of knowledge that meant she knew before they did when they would run low on medical supplies, or when a winter stockpile was inadequate, or when a family was too proud to admit they needed more flour than they had ordered. That knowledge was 3 years of built relationship, and it could not be purchased at a lower price. She restructured the pricing on her core staples and added a service she had been offering informally for years, the advisory component, as a formal feature of the business. She called it the assessment, and everyone laughed at the formal name, but everyone also signed the simple agreement she drafted, because they trusted her, and because they had seen the assessment in action even when she had not been calling it that. Corbett Vines lasted 18 months in Harrows Creek before his Denver backers withdrew, having found that their margins were insufficient because the community loyalty was not shifting the way they had anticipated. He left town without drama, and the 2 customers who had switched their orders came back, a little sheepish, and she received them without comment because she understood that people make practical decisions, and that holding grudges against practical decisions was a luxury she could not afford and did not want. Gilbert had watched all of this with the particular quality of admiration he did not need to say aloud, though he said it anyway, one evening after she had told him about Vines's withdrawal. "You outmaneuvered him completely," he said. "I did not outmaneuver anyone," she said. "I paid attention." "That is what outmaneuvering is," he said, "when you pay attention and others don't." She considered this. "He had more capital and newer equipment," she said. "He should have one on those terms." "But you had something he couldn't buy," Gilbert said. "Trust," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a strange thing, isn't it, that I nearly let my fear of trusting cost me the ability to be trusted by others?" He looked at her carefully. "You found a way through," he said. "We found a way through," she said, and meant it in more ways than one. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was manageable. James was thriving, fat and loud and extremely determined to be mobile far ahead of what any reasonable schedule would suggest, a quality Clara identified as clearly inherited from their mother. Gilbert sold 2 more horses at excellent prices and began to develop a reputation for his breeding program that was bringing buyers from increasingly far afield. Susanna had hired a full-time assistant for the route by now, a young man named Thomas Reardon who was 20 and capable, and who had grown up on a ranch and understood both horses and weather. And the addition of a reliable assistant meant she could run the route more efficiently and be home more reliably. In January of 1885, she and Gilbert sat down and talked about the future in the specific, practical way they had learned to talk about everything that mattered. The horse operation was ready to expand significantly, but the homestead's current land could not support a much larger herd. There was land to the north, a section that had been listed for sale since the previous summer when the family that had settled it gave up and went back east. It was good land, well watered, and the price was fair. They bought it. It was the first truly large financial decision they had made together, and the making of it, the sitting at the kitchen table with the maps and the bank papers, and the calculations written out in Susanna's precise bookkeeping hand, was one of the most intimate things they had done, more intimate in some ways than the wedding, because it was the full joining of their practical lives as well as their personal ones. "We are going to owe the bank for 7 years, she said, looking at the numbers. "The horses will cover it in 4, he said. "That is optimistic. That is what the buyers have been telling me." She looked at him. You have been consulting buyers before discussing this with me. I have been gathering information, he said. That is a fine distinction. It is the same distinction you make when you reroute the loop before telling me the road is out, he said, perfectly calm. She opened her mouth and closed it. He was right. She did do that. Fine, she said. 4 years. 4 years, he agreed. It took 3 years and 8 months, because the reputation of the Townsend breeding program grew faster than either of them had projected, and because Susanna's supply business in the same period expanded to include 3 new communities as the region continued to develop, and because they were, together, significantly more formidable than either of them had been alone, which was not something either of them had entirely predicted, but which the evidence continued to support. In the spring of 1886, Susanna was pregnant again. She told Gilbert at the kitchen table this time because they were past the workshop for these conversations. The workshop was for work now, hers specifically and inviolably hers, which she valued deeply. She told him over coffee, and he did not need to sit down this time, though the expression was the same fundamental expression, the one that had led to the building of a chair and a desk and a room and a life. Again, he said. Again, she said. How are you feeling? Practical, she said. He smiled at that. His smile, after 6 years of knowing him, was still the most useful thing in her world, the thing that calibrated everything back to what actually mattered. Clara, now 11 and in possession of views on every topic, received this news with tempered enthusiasm. She had been the authority on James for 2 years, and had complicated feelings about the establishment of a second sibling to compete for authorial position. She expressed these feelings with complete directness, as she expressed everything, and Susanna listened to all of them without attempting to minimize any of it, because she had learned from Clara that the best way to handle Clara was to take her seriously, which was also simply the respectful thing to do. You will still be the oldest, Susanna told her. I know that, Clara said. It is not about age, it is about whether anyone will still listen to me about geography. James will always listen to you about geography, Susanna said. He is too, Clara said. His geographical knowledge is limited. Give him time, Susanna said. He is enthusiastic. Their second son was born in November of 1886. They named him Robert Elliott Townsend, the middle name after Gilbert's father, who was still living in Ohio, and to whom Gilbert sent a letter about once a month. Robert Elliott was, from the first moments, constitutionally different from his brother, quieter, more observational, with an intensity of attention in his dark eyes that made people feel they were being studied, and which his parents, after a few weeks of observation, identified as clearly coming from his father's side. He watches everything, Clara reported, with a mixture of suspicion and admiration. Like a small papa. Is that a concern? Gilbert asked. No, Clara said, reconsidering. It is probably efficient. James, at 2½, greeted the arrival of his brother with the philosophical equanimity of a child who is too busy learning to walk fast and open things he should not open to have much bandwidth for rivalry. The years between 1886 and 1890 were the years of building, not the quiet, careful building of the early period, when things were fragile and required delicacy, but the full-bodied building of people who have found their footing and are putting up the permanent structures. The supply business grew into what was genuinely the most comprehensive operation in the region, servicing over 40 accounts across 3 loops, employing Thomas Reardon full-time and a second driver 2 days a week, with the mercantile in Harrow's Creek functioning as the hub of something that was recognizably, unambiguously, Susanna's. She had expanded the mercantile twice, had added a postal service arrangement with the federal agent in the next county, and was known across the territory not just as the woman who ran the supply route, but as the woman you came to when you needed to know how to get something done in the mountains efficiently and reliably. Gilbert's horse operation was by 1889 genuinely renowned. Buyers came from Denver, from Santa Fe, from as far as Texas. He had hired 2 permanent hands to help manage the expanded herd, and the north section they had bought in 1885 was fully productive and essential to the operation. He still did the fine work himself, the training and assessment and the relationship building with buyers, because some things are too important to delegate, and this was one of them. Clara went to school in Denver in 1887, a proper school, the kind that had been established specifically to educate young women in subjects of substance, rather than in the purely domestic. She had found it through a pamphlet that she presented to her parents with the confidence of someone who has already made the decision and is now informing them of it. And Susanna had read the pamphlet and looked at Gilbert, and they had both known that the only question was whether they could manage the financing, which they could. Clara wrote letters home every 2 weeks with the discipline and thoroughness of a natural correspondent. She wrote about her classes, about the other students, about Denver, about the things she was learning and the things she already knew and the things she disagreed with. And the letters were so vivid and complete that Susanna kept them in a box in the workshop. Beside the original tin box that held her uncle's letter and her important papers, and which had moved with her from the Harrows Creek Mercantile to the Townsend homestead without ceremony or explanation, because it belonged with her, and this was where she was. In the spring of 1890, Clara came home from Denver with her certificates and a young man she introduced as Edmund Walsh, who was a teacher and who had the specific quality of someone who has just discovered that the woman he loves has 2 younger brothers, a formidable mother, and a father who breeds horses, and is politely but thoroughly assessing him from the first handshake. Edmund Walsh was 24, from Boston originally, educated at an Eastern college and teaching natural sciences at the Denver school, because he believed in science education in the West and had strong opinions about it that Clara had found initially irritating, and then compelling and then essential. He was not a Western man, which was visible in approximately everything, but he was honest, and he was interested in everything, and he was clearly devoted to Clara with a completeness that Susanna recognized as the real thing. She watched Gilbert assess him over 2 days and saw the moment on the second afternoon when Gilbert made up his mind. "He is not afraid of the horses," Gilbert told her that evening. A man from Boston who has never seen a working stable, and he walked in with his hands open and no flinching. "That tells you something." "What does it tell you?" she asked. "That he pays attention to what is actually in front of him rather than what he expected to see," Gilbert said. Susanna nodded. "That is the important quality," she said. "It is the quality she would choose," he said. "Yes," Susanna said, "she would." Clara and Edmund married in Denver that September, a ceremony that was considerably more formal than the one in Harrows Creek 7 years earlier, which everyone felt was appropriate to the respective personalities of the couples involved, and which Susanna attended with James, now 6, in his best clothes and complaining about his collar, and Robert, 3, on Gilbert's shoulders watching the city with the intense analytical attention that was becoming his defining characteristic. The 1890s brought change to the whole territory, as change had always come to the West, arriving in waves and restructuring things that had seemed permanent. The railroad expanded its reach further into the mountain communities, which altered the supply economics significantly. Some of what Susanna had built became less essential as rail delivery made certain products cheaper and faster to obtain, and she adapted the business with the same practical intelligence she had always brought to obstacles, shifting the focus toward the specialty items and emergency services that the railroad could not replicate, toward the deep-root knowledge and the trusted relationships that were, as they had always been, the actual product she was selling. The adaptation was not painless. There were months when the numbers were tighter than she liked, and she and Gilbert had more than one late-night conversation over the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, working through scenarios with the realistic, unsentimental honesty of 2 people who have been doing the hard calculus of a life together long enough to know that honesty is always cheaper than optimism in the long run. But they came through it, because they always came through things, and because the specific combination of Gilbert's stability and Susanna's adaptability was, they had learned over a decade together, almost unreasonably well suited to exactly the kind of challenges the Colorado mountains kept presenting. In 1892, James, now 8, decided that he wanted to work with the horses. This was not a surprise to anyone who had watched him spend his early years following his father through the paddocks, with the focused observation of a natural apprentice. Gilbert began teaching him in the methodical way he did everything, and James absorbed it with the same determined enthusiasm he brought to everything else. And by the time he was 10, he was doing genuine work with the younger horses, and Gilbert was speaking of him to buyers with a quiet pride he did not bother to conceal. Robert, at 6, had declared himself interested in everything but primarily in how things worked mechanically, a quality that manifested in the systematic disassembly of various items around the homestead, which he always reassembled correctly, and which Susanna was trying to direct productively, while also preventing the reassembly of the kitchen stove from becoming a regular occurrence. "He is like you with the accounts," Gilbert told her, watching Robert take apart and reassemble the mechanism of the workshop door latch with complete concentration. "He cannot rest until he understands the thing completely." "I hope he finds something slightly less disruptive to take apart," Susanna said. "He will eventually," Gilbert said. "Right now he is learning what everything is made of." "I am going to tell Mrs. Aldrich to put a lock on the postal scale," she said. "He already knows how it works," Gilbert said. "He asked me last week." She looked at her husband. "You told him." "He had the right questions," Gilbert said without apology. Susanna shook her head, but she was smiling, because this was her family, and it was exactly, precisely, specifically right in all of its particular and impractical and magnificent qualities. The spring of 1894 brought a development that neither of them had anticipated, but which, in retrospect, had the quality of something that had been building quietly under the surface of things for years. A man arrived in Harrow's Creek in March, asking questions about the Pritchard supply business. Not about Susanna Townsend, not about the Townsend homestead, but specifically about the history of the Pritchard operation, asking people who had been in the community long enough to remember the beginning. He was a lawyer, a legitimate one from Denver, and his name was Garfield Hooper, and he found Susanna at the Mercantile on a Tuesday afternoon. She listened to what he had to say with the careful neutrality she had learned to maintain when receiving unexpected information, and what he said was this: Roland Fletcher, the man who had manipulated her in Kansas in 1877, had died in a Denver jail cell in 1891, having finally been caught for the third or fourth version of the same fraud in a new state. Before he died, he had given a statement to a court-appointed attorney, and in that statement he had listed his fraudulent activities, and among them was his Kansas operation, and among the names of people he had defrauded was John Pritchard, Susanna's father, the amount being a specific and recorded sum. The Denver lawyer had been working through the list for 3 years. There was a restitution fund, assembled from the liquidation of Fletcher's accumulated assets when he died. It was not the full amount, it rarely was, but it was a specific sum, and it was available to be claimed by the estate of John Pritchard, who had also since died in 1889 and whose next of kin was Susanna. She sat with this information for a long time after the lawyer left. Then she went home. She told Gilbert that evening, after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table, and she told it all the way through without simplifying anything. He listened as he always listened, with complete attention and without interruption. When she finished, there was quiet. "Your father never told you he had filed a complaint," Gilbert said. "He was too proud," she said, "and probably by the time he filed it he did not think anything would come of it. But something came of it. 13 years later," she said. "Better than never," he said. She was quiet for a moment. It does not undo anything, she said. What Fletcher did, the time, the money, the injury, it does not undo it. No, he said, but it is an acknowledgement that it was real. Yes, she said, and that word, that acknowledgement, was more than she had expected to receive from a story she had filed in the category of things that are simply the cost of learning hard lessons. It is that. What will you do with the money? She had been thinking about this on the ride home. James needs a good horse of his own, a real one, not a training horse. Gilbert nodded. And Robert keeps asking about the mechanical engineering program at the state college. She paused. It is early for that, but I would like to start putting something aside. And you, he said. I do not need anything, she said. He looked at her with the expression she knew best, the particular quality of attention he gave to the things that mattered most to him. There is nothing for yourself, he said, not pressuring, just asking the way he had always asked things. She thought about it genuinely. I would like a better water system for the workshop, she said. A proper pump so I do not have to carry water from the house when I am working there overnight. He nodded. I can build that, he said. I know you can, she said. But this time let me buy the materials. He looked at her. I want to pay for something I use, she said. It is important to me. All right, he said. She took the restitution. She bought James a horse, a good 3-year-old roan gelding that he named Captain with the absolute authority of an 11-year-old who has waited his whole life for a horse of his own. She started a fund for Robert's education. She commissioned the pump for the workshop. And she filed the whole complicated history of Roland Fletcher in a different category in her mind, moved from the cost of learning to the things that were resolved. And the movement was smaller than she had expected and more significant than she had imagined. And she sat in her workshop that evening with the good mountain view out the west window and felt something complete. Clara visited with Edmund and their 2 children, a son named Thomas who was 3 and a daughter named Alice who was 1, in the summer of 1894, and the homestead was full and loud and splendid. Clara's children shared the particular family quality of decisive engagement with the world, Thomas approaching everything with the same geographical certainty his mother had once deployed, and Alice watching everything with Robert's intense assessment, and the combination produced several days of considerable domestic chaos and equal pleasure. Edmund and Gilbert spent a morning in the stable together, which Clara observed from the porch with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose 2 favorite worlds have decided to respect each other, and Susanna sat beside her in the chairs on the porch, the 2 chairs with the small table between them, one of which Gilbert had built, and one of which had replaced the first when it finally wore out, and they drank coffee and watched the mountains in the way of people who have earned the right to sit still. Do you remember when I brought you to the workshop? Clara said. I will remember it my whole life, Susanna said. I was not certain you would follow me, Clara said. Susanna looked at her stepdaughter, who was 20 now and a woman, and thought about the 7-year-old with the 2 uneven braids and the absolute certainty. Were you ever uncertain about anything? She asked. Clara considered this seriously, as she considered all questions seriously. I was not uncertain about you, she said. I was uncertain about whether Papa had finally said anything useful to you. Susanna laughed. He had not, she said. He showed me instead. That is him, Clara said. He builds things when he does not have the correct words. I know, Susanna said. It is one of my favorite things about him. Is it? Clara looked at her with interest. 'Cause words can be wrong, Susanna said. Words can be practiced and false, but building something takes time and intention, and the person in front of you knows that. You cannot build something that means nothing in a matter of minutes. Every hour of it is evidence. Clara looked at her for a moment with the gray-green eyes that were exactly her father's. I think, she said carefully, that you have always understood him better than almost anyone. He made it possible to understand him, Susanna said. By being honest. He learned that from you partly, Clara said. I learned from him first, Susanna said. It was mutual. The afternoon light was turning golden, the particular September gold of the Colorado high country that makes everything look like it is lit from within, And in the paddock, Gilbert was showing Edmund the new foals with the quiet precision of a man in his rightful element. And James was in the near paddock putting Captain through paces with a seriousness and competence that made Susanna's chest tight, with a feeling she had no word for except pride. And Robert was somewhere in the workshop investigating the new pump mechanism, with the careful intensity that meant he had probably already identified 3 improvements. And Alice was asleep in the house, and Thomas had fallen asleep against his grandfather's dog under the fence post. Susanna Pritchard Townsend put her coffee cup down and looked at all of it, the whole wide landscape of her life, and felt the kind of fullness that has nothing to do with having wanted more and everything to do with having found the right thing. The years continued to pass in the way that good years do, each one accumulating its specific texture of events and seasons and small daily moments that are the actual substance of a life. The supply business evolved through the remainder of the 1890s as the territory itself evolved, the railroad changing the regional economics, the population of Colorado growing and spreading, the practical demands of the homesteaders shifting as farms became established, and the pioneer character of the work gave way to the settled character of a functioning community. Susanna adapted with it. She reduced the freight side of the operation as the railroad made it redundant, and expanded the specialty and service side, and eventually what she had built became less about the supply of raw goods and more about the network of relationships and knowledge that she had spent 15 years accumulating. She had something genuinely rare and genuinely valuable, which was the trust of an entire region's worth of people. And that trust generated the kind of business that does not depend on being cheaper or faster, but on being irreplaceable. She hired Thomas Reardon as a full partner in 1897 because he had earned it, and because the partnership would let her reduce her own active hours without reducing the operation's quality, and because she was 42 years old and had been driving the mountain routes since she was 24, and she had earned the right to delegate the February blizzard runs to someone younger. Gilbert's horses continued to be the finest in the region. James, at 15, was already doing genuine breeding assessment work alongside his father, his instinct for the animals being of the caliber that cannot be taught but only recognized and cultivated. And Gilbert was cultivating it with the same patient, methodical care with which he did everything important. Robert went to the State College in 1900, at the age of 14, which was young but not impossibly so given his preparation, and came back at 18 with qualifications in mechanical engineering and a consuming interest in irrigation systems, which was an extremely practical interest in the Colorado mountains, and which served him very well in the years that followed. In 1901, Gilbert and Susanna stood at the fence of the North Paddock that they had bought 16 years earlier and watched a buyer from Texas load 12 of their finest horses into a freight car, and the sum he paid them was enough to make the previous 16 years of careful, patient, consistent work feel not exactly vindicated, because it had never needed vindication but fully seen. "We have done well," Susanna said. "We have done very well," Gilbert said. "I mean all of it," she said, "not just the horses." He looked at her. He was 53 years old, and the gray in his hair had been establishing itself for years, and the lines in his face were the lines of a man who has worked hard and laughed when he had the opportunity and felt things deeply, and she thought as she sometimes did that he was more himself now than he had been at 31. That time had not worn him down but worn him into the shape he had always been aiming for. "Yes," he said, "all of it." She took his hand. They stood at the fence in the October afternoon, the same month in which he had first built for her, the same quality of Colorado light, the mountains to the west unchanged by the decades that had changed everything in front of them. "Clara is coming for Christmas with all 3 children this year," she said. "I know," Edmund wrote. "James says he wants to start his own breeding operation. I know that too, we have been talking about it. Robert sent a letter about an irrigation project near Boulder." "Good," he said. "That is a good use of him." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I was thinking about the other day?" she said. "What?" "The first time you offered me coffee," she said. "February 1880. And I said no because I had 3 more stops before the light went." He smiled. The full, genuine, unguarded smile that she had first heard but never forgotten. "I remember," he said. "I thought I had frightened you off." "You had not," she said. "I know that now," he said. "It took me a while." "You were patient," she said. "You were worth patience," he said simply. She leaned against him in the October afternoon, the way she had been leaning against him for 18 years, with the complete ease of someone who has been in exactly the right place for long enough that it has become the definition of right. "Clara told me in the summer that you learned honesty from me partly," she said. "Clara is perceptive," he said. "She also said I learned it from you first." "We learned it from each other," he said. "That is what it is supposed to be." Above them, the mountain stood in the October light, unchanged and enormous and beautiful, and the valley below them was full of the evidence of what two people can build when they stop being afraid and start paying attention. The homestead with its expanded paddocks, and the workshop with its west-facing window, and the road that Susanna had driven 10,000 times and knew by heart. And somewhere in the house James was making noise about supper, and the dog was barking at something at the fence, and the life they had built was present and full and entirely, incontrovertibly real. She had come to deliver supplies. A child had taken her hand and said, "Come see what Papa built for you." She had followed, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be led toward something you have been afraid to want. She had found a desk at the right height, and a window facing west, and a man who built things instead of lying, and a daughter who had always known and sons she had not imagined, and a life that was, in every particular that mattered, exactly the life she had been driving toward on all those cold mountain roads without knowing it. The compass on the workshop desk still had her initials. S.B. She had not changed the engraving when she changed the name, because the initials were the same, and because it was hers in the original way, the way it had been given, before any of the other layers of good fortune had settled over it. She pressed the compass between her palms sometimes, in the early mornings before the homestead woke, standing at the west window of her workshop with the mountains in front of her, and she thought about direction, about how you can spend years navigating by precision instruments and careful logic and still end up in the wrong place, and how sometimes what gets you to the right one is a small hand in yours and trust enough to follow where it leads. The afternoon deepened into evening, the light going gold and then amber, and then the deep rose that preceded the Colorado dark, and Gilbert's hand was warm in hers. And from the house came the sound of James calling for supper and the dog's bark, and the general cheerful noise of a place that is fully and irreversibly alive. And Susanna Pritchard Townsend smiled at the mountains and came inside.